All right, Shalom. Shalom. First and foremost, as always, I'd like to give all glory, honor, and praises unto Yahweh, Bahashem Yahweh Shai, Bahashem Ruach HaKodesh. All praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashem Yahweh Shai. Double honors unto the apostles and elders and the bishops of Great Millstone. All right, the bishops in Connecticut, elders in Connecticut, the apostles. Shalom to those great men for their labor of love and constant example of fervent faith. So I just wanted to get into this quick little lesson, starting with Judith, the 7th chapter, just getting into really understanding and knowing that all these nations are against us. Us as Israelites, all these nations are completely against us. And that is that's something that should be understood. As an Israelite, you should know that all these nations could care less about us as a nation of people. And they're unified in the oppression of the Israelites. When you look at what we currently see in America with so-called illegals getting deported, it quickly went from just Latinos to so-called Negroes. All right, because you can consider so-called Haitians Negroes. All right, we're all the we're all the same. We're all the so-called darker tribes. We're the same family, and there's a lot of times you can't tell the difference between the so-called Haitian and the so-called Negro, or so-called Negro and the so-called West Indian. There's times when you because we look just alike. All right, so just that example in itself shows what we're dealing with here in Babylon. Okay, and that's not just going to stop here in Babylon. It's going to continue. Okay, the world over, the world, these other nations, they don't mess with Jake either. You go anywhere overseas, those heathens overseas, China and India and Europe and whatnot, they're confederate and unified with the oppression of the Israelites as well. All right, so these last days in particular here in America is really showing tribes here that really came to America and thought they made it, that we still are on the bottom of the barrel. All right, being that all these nations are against us. So this is Judith 7 and verse 6. And it says, but in the second day of Holofernes brought forth all his horsemen in the sight of the children of Israel, which were in Bethulia, and viewed the passages up to the city, and came to the fountains of their waters, and took them, and set garrisons of men of war over them, and he himself removed toward his people. Then came unto him all the chief of the children of Esau, and all the governors of the people of Moab, and the captains of the sea coast, and said, let our Lord now hear a word, that there be not an overthrow in thine army. All right, and it goes on. The story goes on, but the point of me reading this was, as it said, that in verse 8, that then came unto him the chief of the children of Israel, all the chief of the children of Esau, and all the governors of the people of Moab, and the captains of the sea coast, and said, all right, so these nations were they would band together, in solitude to come up against the Israelites. That was something that the nations always did. They would always band together in solitude to come up against the Israelites. All right. And we see that same thing happening with this, with us using, the current situation of Jake's in here in Babylon. Using them as an example. These nations are unified in, the oppression of Israel. Okay? They're unified. So, it's nothing new. It's nothing new. Nobody in America is making an uproar, in particular these other nations. Nobody's making an uproar about why Israelites are the only ones targeted with getting deported. Meanwhile, you got so-called Ukrainians that's over here illegal. All right, when that whole war in Ukraine happened, you had the Ukrainians flooding over here by the thousands, and they're illegals, but you don't see the Trump administration going after them. And a lot of other nations, you don't see that happening. Okay, why? Because these nations are confederate with targeting Israelites. As long as Israel is at the bottom of the food chain, all right, and suppressed and oppressed, that's all that matters for them. Okay? So, continuing on, this is Psalm 83 and verse 1. It says, a song or psalm of Asaph, keep not thou silence, O power, hold not thy peace, and be not still, O power. It says, for lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people and consulted against thy hidden ones. All right. They have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. Okay. So there's nothing more that these heathens want than to have the name of Israel or Israelites, with it being well known that is applied to and pertains to so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans. That's the one thing that these heathens are unified in suppressing, is the identity, the true identity of the Israelites. That is something that the heathen have to suppress. All right. And they're confederate with that. All right, as it says here in verse 5, it says, for they have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against thee. These nations are confederate and unified in their hatred for us Israelites, which is why, once again, the only people being targeted for deportation are so-called Haitians, so-called Latinos, okay, so-called West Indians. All right, the nation of Israel is the only people that Esau is concerned with deporting. All right, they're confederate. It says, verse 6, it says, the tabernacles of Edom, all right, so-called white man, and the Ishmaelites, so-called Arabs, of Moab, and the Hagarenes. All right, now with all the so-called illegals that are so-called Arabs that are here in America, you would think they would be some of the main people targeted for deportation, being that supposedly the Arabs are responsible for 9/11. All right, when 9/11 happened, you had, everybody hating so-called Arabs. All right. Arabs with, and really, that's when, me personally, it became known that there's a, for me, it became known that there's a difference between Arabs and East Indians when 9/11 happened. Because soon afterward, those brown people were hated. Everybody hated those brown looking people. You know what I'm saying? And Elam had to pretty much say, nah, I'm East Indian. I'm not a Arab. Which those Afghanis supposedly was Afghanis that did that shit 9/11, which we know it's all a hoax. That shit wasn't real. Elam is or Afghanis are East Indians, or not East Indians, should I say? But they're Elam, from the nation of Elam. All right, so it was just during that time it was a big clusterfuck of confusion. But if you look anything like an Arab or East Indian, you was automatically hated by so-called Americans during that time. All right, but now all of a sudden, they're upstanding citizens, but so-called Negroes need to get deported. So-called West Indians and Haitians need to get deported. So-called Latinos need to get deported. Crazy. All right, crazy. But once again, it says the tabernacles of Edom and the Ishmaelites, okay, of Moab and the Hagarenes. Hagarenes, I believe, are so-called Africans, some Hamites, and Moab is so-called Chinese. Okay. Verse 7: Gabal and Ammon and Amalek. All right, Ammon and Amalek. Ammon, the so-called Japanese. Amalek, the chief nation of the Edomites, so-called small hats. Okay. The Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre, all right, more Hamites. Ashur also is joined with them. They have hope in the children of Lot, Salah. Okay, so all these nations are against Israel. All these nations are against Israel. And us approaching Jacob's trouble, hot and heavy like we are, is going to do nothing more than certify and solidify that that's the case. That's always been the case. Okay, Jake got him a nice little job in America. So-called progression has happened for the so-called Negroes and the Latinos and all that, and that has rocked Jake to sleep. All right, being too damn comfortable. But guess what? Jacob's trouble is going to serve the purpose of revealing that these nations don't give a shit about us. These Jakes that are doing so-called good have forgot the nature of these heathen. All right, but Jacob's trouble is going to wake them up. All right, and it might not be necessarily to the truth, but they're going to, if they ain't of the elect, they're going to wake up in the spirit world. All right. So this is Joel 3 and verse 1. It says, For behold, in those days and in that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather all nations and will bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat, and will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage, Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land. Okay. So there's more to this, but the point being that the Lord is He's gonna gather all these nations down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. All right, Yahweh's judgment, the Most High's judgment, and He's gonna judge them there, and He's gonna judge them for the purpose of what they have done, what these nations have done to the Israelites. Okay, because once again, all these nations are confederate with the oppression of the Israelites. But I just want to bring that out to the point. Lord willing, this was edifying. Till next time, Yahweh Shem Yahshua Barakatah Shalom.